A rusty knife, Your Honor. Prosecutor Jonathan Blake's voice cut through the courtroom as sharp as the very evidence he was pointing to. That is what the police found on the defendant, Daniel Carter, when he broke into the pharmacy after midnight. The air in the old courtroom grew thick, as heavy as the dust settled on the aging portraits on the walls. At the defendant's table, Daniel Carter kept his head bowed. His rough, fisherman's hands were locked together, trying to still a tremor born not of fear, but of sheer exhaustion. From the high bench, Judge Eleanor Whitmore observed it all through her glasses. Her expression was cold, an impenetrable fortress of justice. Her eyes were fixed on the rusty knife, lying silent in its evidence bag, as if weighing not just the metal's heft, but the very weight of a human life. This act, Blake emphasized each word, is defined by law as armed burglary, a serious felony that threatens the safety of our community. Objection. Defense attorney Sophia Lynn shot to her feet, her voice firm. The prosecution is deliberately painting a work tool as a weapon. Miss Lynn, you will have your turn. Judge Eleanor's voice sounded, low and powerful, without a ripple of emotion. Objection overruled. She glanced at Daniel, her eyes betraying no hint of sympathy. Mr. Carter, do you understand what the prosecutor has just stated? Daniel lifted his head. For the first time, the desperation in his bloodshot eyes met the judge's cold, steady gaze. He wasn't looking at her power, but at the woman in the wheelchair behind the tall, wooden bench. His voice was hoarse, cracking on the final words. I understand. But my daughter. She couldn't breathe. Days earlier, the storm had been just a distant warning on the radio. Inside the small, cozy home he shared with his daughter, Daniel Carter, was mending a worn fishing net. The salty scent of the sea mingled with the faint smell of antiseptic, creating an atmosphere of profound peace. Lucy, his 6-year-old daughter, sat on the floor, carefully coloring a picture of a mermaid with shimmering golden hair. She was Daniel's entire world, a fragile, precious world held together by the boundless love of a single father. Daddy, Lucy looked up, a flicker of worry in her clear eyes. My heart's beating like a drum again. Daniel let the net fall from his hands, his own heart sinking. He knelt beside her, pressing his ear to her tiny chest. It was true. Her heartbeat was abnormally fast, as chaotic as small waves just before they break into a squall. Her congenital heart condition was a storm always brewing inside her chest, and the small pills prescribed by Dr. Marco Rossi were the only dam holding it back. He hurried to get the medicine bottle. As he tipped the last pill into his palm, a cold dread shot down his spine. It was empty. The bottle was empty. He had planned to get a refill tomorrow, never imagining her condition would worsen so suddenly. Just then, the real storm hit. The wind howled outside, whipping, stinging rain against the window panes like thousands of tiny pebbles. Lucy's coughing grew heavier, her small chest rising and falling weakly. Daniel grabbed his phone, but there was no signal. The storm had knocked out the lines. Daddy, I can't breathe. Lucy's voice was a mere whisper, and Daniel saw his greatest fear realized. Her lips were beginning to turn blue. Helplessness gnawed at him. Dr. Rossi was in the next town over, unreachable. An ambulance would never make it in time through this storm. The only option left was the pharmacy in the center of town, just a 15-minute walk away. He didn't hesitate for a second. Daniel threw on a heavy sea jacket, shoving the knife he used to mend his nets, still tangled with a few threads, into his pocket out of habit. It was a constant companion, a tool, not a weapon. But in his panic, he didn't think about that. He only knew he had to go. I'll be right back, he said, kissing her forehead. Grandma will be here with you. Agnes, his late wife's mother, rushed over, her old face etched with worry as she saw her granddaughter's state. Go, son, hurry. Daniel plunged into the night. The storm seemed to want to swallow him whole. The wind tore at his jacket, and the frigid rain lashed his face. He practically had to crawl along the coastal road, fighting against every furious gust. There was only one image in his mind, Lucy's face, slowly turning blue. When he finally reached the pharmacy, his last door of hope slammed shut. A wooden sign dangled from the door, closed due to storm. Daniel pounded on the door, screaming the pharmacist's name, but only the wind answered. He peered through the glass window and saw the neat rows of medicine on the shelves. The life-saving medicine his daughter needed was right there, separated only by a pane of glass, yet it felt a world away. Time was running out. With every passing second, Lucy's life was draining away. Desperation pushed the father to his breaking point. He picked up a paving stone that had been dislodged by the storm. His hand trembled. He knew what he was about to do. This was a crime. But letting his daughter die because of a broken system felt like a far greater one. The deafening shatter of glass tore through the raging night. Daniel scrambled inside, shards of glass slicing small cuts into his hands, but he felt no pain. He flicked on his phone's flashlight, ran straight to the familiar counter, and grabbed the exact box of medicine he had seen 100 times before. Money didn't exist in his mind. His only goal was Lucy's life. As he turned to leave, clutching the box like a treasure, a blinding light flashed across his face. 2 police officers stood silhouetted in the doorway, their raincoats soaked. "Freeze! Drop the weapon!" Daniel stood stunned, his hand still clamped around the medicine. They searched him and pulled the net-mending knife from his pocket. The cold metal touched the officer's hand, and in their eyes, a desperate father instantly became an armed burglar. "Please," Daniel stammered, his voice shattering amidst the storm's howl. "My daughter, she needs this." Back in the courtroom, defense attorney Sophia Lynn rose, her voice calm but carrying immense weight. "Your Honor, to clarify my client's motive, I would like to call a series of witnesses. First, the defendant himself, Mr. Daniel Carter." Daniel walked to the witness stand, his steps heavy, as if his feet were made of lead. He avoided looking at anyone, placing his hand on the Bible and mechanically reciting the oath. "Mr. Carter," Sophia began gently, "please tell the court, not as a defendant, but as a father, what happened to your daughter that night." Daniel took a deep breath, his voice trembling as the horrifying memories flooded back. "My girl, Lucy," she said. Her heart was beating like a drum. Then she started coughing. "I knew the signs. I went to get her medicine, but the bottle was empty." He brought a rough hand to his face, trying to hide his vulnerability. "It was my fault. I forgot." "And then the storm hit?" Sophia prompted. "Yes," Daniel nodded. "The wind was howling, the phone lines were dead. I looked at my daughter, and her lips were starting to turn blue." He looked up, directly at Judge Eleanor, his eyes pleading. "Your Honor, do you have children? Have you ever felt that helplessness, watching the most precious thing in your life slipping through your fingers while you can do nothing?" The courtroom fell silent. Prosecutor Blake started to rise in objection, but an ice-cold glare from Judge Eleanor made him sit back down. "I couldn't think of anything else," Daniel continued, his voice breaking. "I just knew I had to get the medicine. Right then. That knife. My God, I use it to mend my nets every single day. It was in my pocket out of habit. I swear I never intended to hurt anyone with it." When Daniel returned to his seat, Agnes was called to the stand. The old woman, with her snow-white hair, walked slowly. She looked at no one but her granddaughter, who was sitting in the front row. "Were you there when Lucy was struggling to breathe?" Sophia asked. "Yes," Agnes answered, her voice choked with tears. "I held her in my arms. Her little chest was barely moving. She kept clutching my shirt, whispering, 'Daddy, Daniel is a good father. Since his wife passed, he's worked the sea and raised that child all by himself. He wouldn't hurt a fly, let alone rob a store with a knife.'" She broke down sobbing. If he hadn't risked everything that night, if he had just sat there and obeyed the law, I probably wouldn't have my granddaughter to hold anymore. Her tears could have moved even the hardest of hearts in the room. The final, and most crucial, witness was Dr. Marco Rossi. The middle-aged cardiologist took the stand with the calm authority of an expert. "Doctor," Sophia asked, "could you please explain to the court Lucy Carter's condition and the importance of the medication Daniel took?" Dr. Rossi adjusted his glasses. "Lucy Carter has a complex congenital heart defect known as tetralogy of Fallot. In simple terms, her heart doesn't pump enough oxygenated blood to the body. When an episode occurs, triggered by something like a cold or stress, her oxygen levels drop dramatically. That's when the patient's lips and skin turn blue." He looked directly at the court, his voice turning serious. "That specific medication works by relaxing the blood vessels, allowing blood to flow more easily and increasing oxygen levels. Without it, even for a few hours during a severe episode, the result could be irreversible brain damage, a coma, or worst of all, cardiac arrest." A dreadful silence enveloped the room. "So, doctor," Sophia pressed, "is it fair to say that without that medicine at that exact moment, Lucy Carter's life was in grave danger?" "It isn't a matter of fair to say," Dr. Rossi replied decisively. "I am stating it as a fact. Mr. Carter's actions, while legally wrong, were, from a medical standpoint, a race against death. That box of medicine, at that moment, was his daughter's life." The doctor's testimony was the final hammer blow, shattering the prosecution's narrative of an armed burglary. Every eye in the room now turned to Judge Eleanor Whitmore. She sat motionless in her wheelchair, her hands gripping the armrests, her face still a cold mask. But deep in her eyes, another storm seemed to be brewing. Judge Eleanor Whitmore announced a 15-minute recess. The dry crack of the gavel echoed, releasing the room from its suffocating silence. She guided her wheelchair from the bench and into her private chambers behind it. The heavy oak door clicked shut, leaving her in a quiet space that could not silence the storm within her. She leaned her head against the back of the chair, closing her eyes in exhaustion. The testimonies replayed in her mind. Her lips were starting to turn blue. A race against death was his daughter's life. The law was a straight line, clear and rigid, but life, she was feeling now, was a messy tangle of love, fear, and impossible choices. She looked down at her own motionless legs, a bitter reminder of fate's fragility. Justice could stand tall, but the person who served it could not. Just then, a faint creak. The chamber door pushed open. A small head with a shock of blonde hair peeked in. It was Lucy. The girl had slipped away from her grandmother's watch while no one was looking. Eleanor's brow furrowed, her professional severity kicking in. "You are not allowed in here." But Lucy wasn't afraid. She stepped inside, her tiny red shoes making no sound on the thick carpet. She didn't look at the judge's authoritative presence. Instead, her eyes settled on the wheelchair, then moved down to Eleanor's still legs. "Do your legs hurt?" Lucy asked, her voice crystal clear, filled not with pity, but with innocent curiosity. Eleanor was stunned by the direct question. Most people avoided the subject as if it were taboo. "They don't work anymore," she replied, her voice a bit brittle. Lucy moved closer, her wide eyes seeming to see past the judge's hardened exterior to the fatigue and loneliness beneath. She placed her tiny hand on the judge's knee, a touch that was gentle but incredibly warm. "Grown-ups sometimes forget," Lucy said with a solemn air, as if sharing a great secret, "that love is stronger than fear." Eleanor was silent. The words of a 6-year-old felt like a verdict, not on the law, but on her own life. Seeing her silence, Lucy tilted her head and continued, her voice full of a faith so pure it felt like a fact of nature. "Don't worry. If you let my daddy go, I'll help you stand up." There was no laughter, no disbelief, just the two of them in the quiet room. Lucy's promise, spoken in this private moment, was not a public challenge but a covenant of faith, a whisper of a miracle. It struck something deep inside Eleanor, a place the law could not reach. Just then, a security officer opened the door in a panic. "My apologies, Your Honor." The little girl. "It's all right," Eleanor cut in, her voice uncharacteristically soft. She held Lucy's gaze for a long moment. "Take her back to her family." As Lucy was led away, she glanced back and gave the judge a small, determined smile. The door closed, but the innocent, shocking promise hung in the air, planting a seed of bewilderment and also of hope in the judge's heart. When the court reconvened, the tension was thicker than before. Everyone was anticipating a verdict. Prosecutor Blake rose, ready for his final arguments, but Judge Eleanor held up a hand to stop him. "This court is in recess," she announced, her voice sounding strangely different, no longer cold as steel. "The verdict will be delivered tomorrow morning at 9. A murmur spread through the courtroom. This was an unusual move. Without waiting for a reaction, Eleanor guided her wheelchair back into her chambers, leaving behind a sea of bewildered faces and a Daniel Carter lost in the depths of his anxiety. That night, in her quiet house overlooking the sea, Eleanor couldn't sleep. Lucy's naive promise haunted her. "If you let my daddy go, I'll help you stand up." It was an absurdity, an impossibility, yet the sincerity in the child's eyes had stirred something that had long been dormant within her. She looked down at her useless legs, feeling their familiar imprisonment. The law, like this wheelchair, was a necessary framework, but sometimes it was also a prison. Lost in thought, a soft knock came at her door. She was surprised. Who would be calling this late? It was a young court clerk, looking hesitant. "Forgive the intrusion, Your Honor," he said, "but there's something I was asked to deliver to you personally." He held out a piece of drawing paper, folded into a square. "The little girl, Defendant Carter's daughter." She pressed it into my hand as court adjourned. She said it was very important. Eleanor took the paper, feeling the warmth still lingering from the child's touch. After the clerk had left, she slowly unfolded it. Inside, there were no lengthy words. There was only a drawing, a large heart, colored in a clumsy but radiant red. From its sides, 2 pure white wings stretched out powerfully. Beneath the drawing, in the clumsy scrawl of a child just learning to write, was a single sentence: "You don't have to stand to be strong. When you know how to forgive, wings grow from your heart." The paper slipped from her fingers. Eleanor looked down at her useless legs, then back at the drawing of the winged heart. A simple but profound truth hit her like a jolt of electricity. Strength didn't come from her legs, nor did it come from the rigid letter of the law. It came from compassion. Freedom wasn't the ability to walk, it was the ability to forgive. For the first time since the accident, not from physical pain, but from a soul-shaking epiphany, Judge Eleanor Whitmore wept. The next morning, the courtroom was packed. The air was thick with anticipation. Daniel Carter sat petrified, while Agnes prayed silently beside him. When Judge Eleanor Whitmore entered, everyone noticed a change. The usual cold mask was gone, replaced by an extraordinary calm, though her eyes were slightly bloodshot. She didn't look at the thick case files before her. Instead, she looked directly down at Daniel and Lucy. After reviewing all the facts of this case, Eleanor began, her voice trembling slightly, but each word clear and firm. "This court finds that the defendant, Daniel Carter, while in violation of the law, acted out of dire necessity to save his daughter's life." Prosecutor Blake shot to his feet to object, but Eleanor raised a hand, silencing him. "The law exists to protect society, but it cannot be blind to matters of life and death. The defendant had no intent to steal and no intent to harm. His sole intent was to save his child." She took a deep breath. "Therefore, the court rules, Defendant Daniel Carter is free to go." A collective sigh of relief swept through the room. Daniel was stunned, unable to believe what he was hearing. However, Eleanor continued, her voice gaining a steely edge. "You will be placed on probation for a period of 6 months." She paused, then addressed the entire room. But this verdict does not end here. This court also orders the town council and the local health department to immediately establish a protocol for providing emergency medicine to children in life-threatening situations, free of charge. She raised her voice, her words an undeniable command, to ensure that from this day forward, no child will pay the price for a failure of our system. At this, the dam of emotion she had held back all night finally broke. A single tear traced a path down the judge's cheek. Daniel, overcome with joy, swept Lucy into a hug. The girl wriggled free and ran straight towards the judge's bench. To everyone's astonishment, Lucy held her small hand out to Eleanor. "You forgave," she whispered. In that moment, Eleanor was no longer a judge. She was a human being. Her trembling hands reached out, taking Lucy's for the first time in the middle of the court. An incredible warmth flowed from the child's hand into hers, and then the impossible happened. Eleanor felt something, a faint tremor, a surge of sensation she hadn't felt in years running down her paralyzed legs. She gasped, tears streamed freely down her face. She gripped Lucy's hand tighter, as if drawing from an invisible source of strength. With her other hand, she grabbed the side of the wooden bench. Eleanor summoned all her will, biting her lip, and then, slowly, shakily, before the astonished eyes of the entire courtroom, Judge Eleanor Whitmore rose from her wheelchair. She stood there, unsteady but upright. Tears streamed down her face. The courtroom held its breath for a second, then erupted in thunderous applause. It wasn't just applause for a just verdict, but for a miracle that had just unfolded before their very eyes. Inspired by the child's drawing of a winged heart, Eleanor established an emergency medical fund, naming it Lucy's Wings. The fund went on to help countless families in need, ensuring no child would ever have to gamble with their life because of a failure in the system. The story of the judge who found her strength in a child's faith quickly became the town's legend. From then on, Eleanor Whitmore was no longer spoken of as a symbol of rigid law, but as the embodiment of justice with a heart. Sometime later, in Judge Eleanor's chambers, a place that once held only thick law books and a cold silence, a new picture hung on the wall. It was formally framed and placed where she could see it every day from her desk. It was a gift from Lucy. The girl had drawn a vibrant and beautiful picture. In the center, Judge Eleanor stood tall, with no wheelchair or cane, her face no longer stern but smiling a gentle smile. Beside her, Daniel and Lucy held hands, their own smiles as radiant as the morning Sunday, and above all three of them, a pair of enormous white wings stretched out, sheltering them. From these wings, warm, golden-pink rays of light radiated out like an aura of love and forgiveness. The picture was more than a gift. It was a reminder that true justice isn't about punishment, but about healing. And as evening settled over the coastal town, the bells of the old church by the sea would ring, their chimes carrying over the white-capped waves. The sound spread through the air, not just as a call to prayer, but as a final affirmation. An affirmation that when justice stops judging blindly and learns to walk with love, then even the darkest storms will pass, and the whole world will find hope.